Thank you for coming today to have a lot of people to the seminar. We have two presentations, one from Elysa Ioannou titled Optimizing Physical Activity Interventions After Gestational Diabetes, and the second by Dr. Kirk, Extent and Effects of Extreme Weight Cutting in Combat Sports. So we'll start with the presentation and then we'll continue as usually with questions and answers. And we have plenty of time, I think. Hopefully we can finish each presentation within half an hour, each presentation. Okay, so I'll leave you to Elysa.
Okay. I will. Okay, there's a few people online. Hi everyone. Hi everyone in the room. I'm going to try and split looking at everyone here. I'm going to basically just guide you through, there's two sections to my presentation. In the first one, I'm going to just represent what I gave at SPARC in November, at BASES in November, and take you through those slides, what I did with the systematic review. And then for the second half, I'm just going to briefly go over the kind of overview of my PhD, what the thesis might look like, and just talk about where I am now and what I've done to kind of get here so far and what's next. So I'm going to start off, as I said, with presenting what I presented at BASES in November. It was mid-November time. So I haven't really looked at these slides since then, but I do remember what I've done. So hopefully I can just take you through all of that. Essentially what we did was, it was a systematic review. We used the sociological model to quantify intervention components, and I'll guide you through that as well. But ultimately, it's all looking at that preventing or reducing risk of type 2 diabetes after gestational diabetes through physical activity as sort of one mode of doing that. So just to kind of set out the rationale or the background for this, women who've had gestational diabetes, so it's a diabetes in pregnancy, it's specific to pregnancy, that's why it's called gestational diabetes. Ideally, what you would see is an increase in sort of blood sugar levels at around the 20-week mark, but it can be diagnosed earlier or later. But essentially, women who have had this pregnancy-specific diabetes tend to have an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes later on in life. And actually, there was a review in 2021 that basically quantified that as being almost a 10 times increased risk, which is quite a significant risk. And so since we know that this sort of target population of women are more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, intervening in these women can be a sort of cost-effective preventative way of reducing the sort of total numbers of type 2 diabetes that we tend to see across the world, but specifically in the UK as well. And on top of that, so NICE, which is the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, they've basically outlined that postpartum or sort of after that gestational diabetes, women should be advised about lifestyle changes and reducing sort of future risk of diabetes. And on top of that, the Jens Lund Alliance recently, I say recently, it was recently when I started my PhD, but it's been 2 or 3 years now because I'm way old into this PhD. But they basically got together, did a priority settings partnership, and they also identified that this topic area, so specifically looking at reducing risk of type 2 diabetes after gestational diabetes, is sort of a key research area that needs to be looked into a bit more. So that kind of helped guide where we wanted to look at. On top of that, we know that lifestyle changes, lifestyle modifications, physical activity being one of those, can actually reduce future risk of type 2 diabetes by up to 50%, but even for women who've had gestational diabetes. So we do know that it can be helpful. That's why we're looking at specifically physical activity within this area. And we're using the sociological model for several reasons. So the first off is that there have been interventions, as I've said, that look at physical activity and future diabetes risk in various different ways. So we know that there's a need for looking at physical activity. However, what we do see is large rates of dropouts, really low maintenance, difficulties with adherence, and so on. Often uptake is also low. So for example, for the National Diabetes Prevention Programme in the UK, it has been shown as effective, but it tends to work for people who are like over 65, which is a very kind of unique group of people. Whereas women who've had gestational diabetes are probably, when I say relatively young, obviously you can be any age when you're pregnant, but they're not usually over 65 if they've just had gestational diabetes. So we know that it's missing these women. And the sociological model essentially is just one way of trying to look at or quantify factors that surround an individual, so those contexts at these sort of 5 different levels. So we have that interpersonal level, which is basically the individual who sits in the center. And then there's these other levels that are all sort of interrelated that can impact on an individual's behavior. So things like at the interpersonal level, which could be influence of friends or partner or lack of, organizational, which could be more workplace settings or healthcare settings, or even things like childcare specific to this population, and I'll sort of come to that later on in the results. Community settings, which could be physical, sort of local communities and access to resources, but could also be the more social sense of community, so being in a community of people. And then policy level decisions, such as any guidelines or regulations or sort of ways of following through procedure that might be at play. So we just wanted to use this model to make sense of some of those interventions looking at physical activity, just so that we can target a little bit better some of those wider contextual influences that might be impacting women's ability to be active after pregnancy, specifically for women who've had gestational diabetes. So that's essentially what we did. So we had these three main research questions, which was looking at physical activity interventions that have been implemented so far, or any trials that were there. What levels or which levels of the sociological model were incorporated? So did interventions just target someone as an individual? Did they include any childcare? Did they include any social level work and so on? So we wanted to know what's been going on. So roughly what the patterns were. And then looking at the number of levels. So sort of the theory behind the sociological model is that if we do whole systems approaches and target these multiple levels, it might be more effective. So we were interested to see, well, how many numbers of these levels were included? Was it just one or two targeted? Did people use all five? Does that make any difference or not? And then finally, the sort of meatier question, which was looking at intervention components. So by the intervention components, essentially, because this was a review, I looked at the papers, looked at what they talked about interventions, including protocol papers that had that description of, maybe it was an intervention that was 3 times a week, or it might have been in a healthcare setting, or they might have included childcare, they might have used using things like partner support within interventions and so on. So when I talk about components, it was just quantifying what those things were. So were there behavior change strategies involved? Was there childcare involved, and so on? So I basically wanted to look at those components and then almost organize or narratively synthesize which components tended to lead to significant or just increases in physical activity, which I quantified as either yes, significant, yes, just there was an increase in physical activity, but it wasn't significant, or no, there was no change in physical activity. And I'll refer to that again later on and tell you guys again about that. You don't need to worry about everything that's on this slide. It's just giving you a snapshot of the inclusion criteria of the review. So looking at women who have had gestational diabetes within 5 years, and there had to be any physical activity component. I think there's someone's sound on and it's a little bit distracting. I think I can mute, okay. Yeah, so it was just looking at women who've had gestational diabetes at some point, and any intervention that looked at physical activity. It didn't have to solely be physical activity, and actually we didn't find a lot that was solely physical activity. A lot of the time it could have been tied in with other sort of like dietary components and things like that, which was absolutely fine, but we tried to tease away the physical activity results, as usually they were both reported. Okay, so that's just a rough idea of the type of interventions and sort of papers we looked at. We didn't also exclude papers for, say, not being RCTs. Actually, we really wanted to know everything out there. So not just randomized control trials, even pre-post, even community-based interventions, even pilot studies, just anything that gave us the meatiness of interventions. So I'm going to mute someone else because it's like a little bit loud. Anyway, I think I can't find who's unmuted. Whoever's online, if you don't mind muting yourselves, that would be really helpful. Thank you. This doesn't let me mute, so no, it doesn't let me mute that one. Oh well, okay, I think we're okay now. Anyway, so that was the idea of the kind of interventions we included. We didn't want to disclude anything because we wanted to really understand what's been done and see any patterns that emerged. It was narratively synthesized because it's more about looking at patterns. Okay, so again, that's a really small Prisma diagram, but it's just to tell you that we did use sort of Prisma guidelines. You don't need to know the stages of each of those searches. Hopefully this will be published at some point in the near future, depending on how fast reviewers are at this point. But essentially we ended up with 42 studies included in the review, which meant that was 35 interventions. And just to explain that briefly, essentially, as I mentioned, I did use protocol papers, and they gave a lot of meaty information about an intervention, but maybe didn't have any physical activity results. So then where then results were published, I kind of grouped those as like an intervention, but obviously that was 2 separate papers included like within the review. So I'm going to take you through 3 main slides, which are the results, and I will talk you through them. So the first thing, which was the first question, which was, well, which levels have been included? And the interesting thing was that every single intervention included both the sort of individual middle layer, that intrapersonal layer, and that social or interpersonal layer. So there was always some form of the two. And really that was also because like if an intervention was delivered, it was delivered by someone. There was that mode of support in that way. So often that was the very least. But on top of that, there were some family-based interventions that included other levels of like social within that. The next most common level that we saw was this policy level, which was included in, I think, 2/3 of the interventions, which again was more in the sense of mentioning physical activity guidelines to women, or this idea of at least talking to women about that postpartum diabetes risk. And then we had the organizational level, which was in less than half of the interventions. And that was things like any work-based or childcare provision and things like that. And then the community level, which was the least appearing level, things like creating community groups and support mechanisms within interventions. And that only appeared in like 8 interventions. So that's just giving you a spread of what we saw. Obviously, I know it adds up to more than 35, but the idea is like, and you'll see in the next slide, it's not like it was only interpersonal and social within that. Actually, they might have had that plus an organizational level or plus a policy level, which is why those numbers don't necessarily add to a nice neat 35. So that led to our second question, which was like, okay, so what number of levels have been used and what were the results within these? So just as a reminder, that Y star was the ones that saw significant physical activity increases. Again, this could have been either by self-report or objective measures, and there was a whole different range of measuring them, which is why we've just categorized them for the sake of a pattern and comparison. Obviously, there's limitations in that, but when I come to sort of the other main results, we'll see they align quite well with the literature, so we have a little bit of confidence in that. The Y was just seeing physical activity increases. It might not have been significant. This was especially important for us to take into account and separate those two because we did use pre-post interventions. It wasn't just randomized controlled trials. So sometimes those physical activity increases were something that was meaningful, even if they weren't significant, okay, depending on how that was reported within the paper. And then we also looked at the papers that didn't have any significant or any physical activity increases. The one thing missing on here are the papers which were quantified as U, which were the protocol papers or papers that didn't have results. So when we talked about those 42 papers included initially, this is mainly the results of the 35 interventions, taking the intervention as a whole. And actually, just to pull your attention, the interventions we saw that included at least 4 or more levels. So the more levels that an intervention included, the more significant physical activity increases we saw, which fits really neatly in the idea of the sociological model that we see a lot more significant increases with these wider levels, which gives that idea that, well, maybe there's some contextual roles at play that if we address those, we're more likely to get those physical activity increases. And then breaking this down, obviously this is again, a lot of information, you don't need to look at it all, but essentially the orange ones or the ones that sort of the first 5 that are on the screen, those were those individual, again, I kind of color-coded them as I presented the sociological in the beginning, but it's that individual level stuff. So like behavior change or education or like things like monitoring, using apps for information and things like that. All those were in that individual level, sort of targeting an individual. We saw quite a range of results, again, that N being no physical activity increases, Y being physical activity increases, Y star being significant, and the U being just those protocol papers. But the ones I want to draw your attention to is things like having a layperson deliver the intervention, using a group-based setting, having remote delivery of information, exercise during sessions, and especially providing childcare. We see with these ones, actually, you get a lot more physical activity increases or significant physical activity increases than none. And actually taking that forward, that has quite important implications. So as I mentioned, obviously, this was a big review. It was narrative. There was a few limitations, obviously, in how we had to analyze everything, but the results that we see aligned really well with sort of the wider literature and also the theory of the sociological model. So that helped us gain a little bit of confidence in what we were seeing and the results that we were generating from this. So while we know that that individual or that sort of interpersonal level matters, and it does matter, we still need that education, we still need the behavior change theories, we still need all of these good stuff. But there's these wider levels of these wider contextual constraints that have been or are probably playing a big role in terms of that access, especially within this group of women. And those can be constraints for physical activity. So we should be looking at those sort of individual levels, but we should be using that in conjunction with some of those wider levels, like providing childcare, using group settings, and so on. And that's because we know things like a role as a mother, which is something that might be a social norm or community level norm, that really impacts on someone's ability to want to undertake exercise or be physically active. So addressing that at sort of wider levels might be important. Things like lack of time and flexibility, widely cited in the literature, especially in postpartum women, and general physical activity sort of literature looking at increasing that. Things like the group-based sessions being effective for that shared experience and that support, and that people, specifically with gestational diabetes, that they want support, but a lot of them might have felt judged by healthcare professionals or had a negative experience. So a lot of people want just wider support outside of that. So in terms of implications for that, we should be thinking that providing childcare, which was one of those key things that we saw, should be a must really for this group of women. Looking at remote delivery of information as well. So not just having those group settings, but also having that power and that flexibility in accessing information that's, you know, sort of solid information and that's trustworthy information. Connecting women with other women so they can share that experience and sort of get that support as well. And possibly having lay people deliver interventions, but obviously these things could and do require further research. And if you are thinking of developing an intervention, you'd probably want to use like co-production PPI methods within that, taking this into account as well. So that's just finalizing that little review. And I'm just going to place that in the context of my PhD, so the work that I've done so far, what's coming and what's sort of at the end, which is now not that far away. So big overview. I'm going to show you the slide several times as I kind of show how we've been progressing through it. So you don't need to worry about looking at it all right now. But first of all, the first thing I sort of started with was a very big literature review. That one I presented here on top of looking at some gray literature, working with my PPI group. And essentially what I did was I developed these if-then outcome statements. Because the overall PhD, it's realist inspired in the sense that we've taken some really key components in this idea of developing something, some rough theory, I'd say, but it's not real theory, just to make sense of what's going on. So I ended up with these initial rough program theories. Again, it's not strictly realist because it's not, but it's just that inspiration of taking that. So as an example, and this is just one example of some of the theories I've been developing initially. So title being that, you know, competing demands largely affect ability to make lifestyle changes. So if women were to take on their role as mother, prioritizing other life aspects, then they may experience guilt in prioritizing themselves or their health, feel like they must, or instead prioritize looking after the children or house or other priorities that they had. The outcome of that would be low adherence or uptake, as the interventional physical activity is not considered a priority in comparison to other demands. And this might seem like stating the obvious, but it's not really been done before. And it's something that probably needs to be put forward for people to start thinking about, well, hang on, how do we address this going forward? Or how do we more effectively address this going forward? So that was that first little step, which I finished about a year ago now, maybe just over. And then I started doing a first cycle of refinement, which we started working on another barrier facilitated paper. It was another review, so second review, because I just love systematic reviews apparently, which was looking at barriers facilitated to physical activity. This is just a little snapshot of what we looked at. So again, using that same model, sociological model, I gathered all the papers I could find on barriers and facilitators. Again, most of them use a combination of lifestyle, so physical activity and diet, and I specifically tried to extract what was reported for physical activity only to try and isolate some of those. So at that interpersonal level, things like people talking about postnatal depression, being unable to cope. At that social level, people sort of really emphasizing that, you know, sort of husband or partner support was really key in being able to access or do any physical activity, or things like socializing while exercising, which isn't uncommon in physical activity research. Things like at the organizational level, people expressing that frustration with some interactions with healthcare professionals, especially during pregnancy and the effects of that afterwards, or people mentioning either they didn't have access to childcare or they didn't want to access the childcare they maybe had available. They maybe didn't want to rely on family members to do childcare for the sake of being active. There was one quote, for example, like, "My children are my responsibility. I do not ask other people to mind them unless it's an emergency." So people not wanting to sort of be that burden on others. And then at community level, things like, if there was access to resources, people might have found that helpful. So this is just a little snapshot. I have also separated just the barriers, just the facilitators and so on, but I just tried to merge a little bit to give you an overview of what we did in this review. Currently trying to prepare that for a publication as well. So those were that first, second cycle. I'm also refining those theories again, like I initially developed, but I don't have any of those yet to present. But currently I'm in the stage of data collection, which is going to add to that second and third cycle of refinement. Because with the realist inspired work, we do look to these cycles and using multiple types and levels of evidence for that. So that second cycle of refinement will be interviews with women, which I'm in the process of analyzing currently. And then also looking at interviews with stakeholders. So the first thing that we did was recruited women using STH. I managed to do 12 interviews around October, November time last year, had them transcribed, now working on sort of all of that phonetic analysis and coding. So I ended up with, like I said, 12 people taking part. And then I'm currently just about starting my stakeholder recruitment. So if anyone knows of anyone who's ever worked with women who've had gestational diabetes, please do send them my way. Maybe I can send out that recruitment sheet as well for anyone who wants to forward that on. That'd be incredibly helpful. And then after I've done all that recycle, I'm going to end up with these final rough theories, which I'll present again in this if then outcome so what statements. So it just gives us a little neat thing to kind of go forward with. And on top of that, I want to then go back and develop some recommendations, which I'm hoping to censor check and sort of a group workshop with a mix of women who've had gestational diabetes on top of some stakeholders as well. So that's kind of a little overview of that. Does anyone have any questions about either section of that presentation?
And when you're talking about significant increase in physical activity, was that something you just like, was that said in this study basically, or was that something you decided?
No, so it was whatever the study quantified. So this was the other thing, limitation, the difficulty with analyzing all this stuff, because some of the studies, they weren't just targeted at physical activity. They may be quantified, you know, their studies being significant if they saw significant weight loss or they saw significant uptake in something else. But often they would have a table, and in that table they would have a p-value. And they might have decided, okay, well, this is an objective significant increase in physical activity, or if they use self-report, again, they may be tested pre and post, depending on how they decide to do that. So again, that really depended on the type of study that was included. But I just took whatever the study itself decided was significant. But the limitation in that also is, again, we were looking at physical activity. The paper itself might have not only looked at physical activity. So again, what classifies as a significant result for that paper versus non, you know, but we just tried to extract physical activity to just see what's going on.
What does an output from your PhD program look like?
Well, so the first output was obviously presenting at BASES, presenting here today, hopefully get some people within the department within SPARC aware of what's going on, especially for like disseminating some of these things. I'm currently in the process of trying to submit 2 different manuscripts in 2 different journals. On top of that, I work closely with Diabetes UK, and I've written a blog for them before and written some stuff for them before that they sort of put out there. And I'm hoping that we can continue sort of working with charities as well and kind of get some of the messages out there. And when I get to those recommendations, especially at the end, that'd be a neat little thing people can hopefully take forward and think about it in terms of trying to change policy or look at, you know, how systems are currently functioning and maybe how we can start to change some of those systems.
How did you learn about the recruitment? Did you find that quite challenging?
Oh yeah. I came into this expecting recruitment to be hard, and I don't think I was prepared for actually how challenging it was going to be. Because I came into it, I mean, I started my PhD just as sort of we were in another COVID lockdown. I think it was the one that was January to June and the whatever date it was, because dates don't make sense anymore. And so I came into it thinking, okay, this is going to be a huge challenge. No one's in contact with anyone. I don't know what's going on. So I planned for it that we could recruit initially, hopefully, through different charities and local communities. I did that for like 6 months and got no one. It was really challenging because a lot of people either weren't aware of their diagnosis, and actually that's kind of, some of that has come from some of the interviews I've actually done now, is that everything changed in COVID. So there's this period of time where women were missed in terms of diagnoses. The way they were diagnosed with gestational diabetes changed, which could have made it a little less sensitive too. People just felt less connected. It wasn't clear what they had to do. They no longer had face-to-face interactions of like how to take blood glucose. So they had to figure that out on their own if they even realized they had to go pick up a kit. So there's a lot of stuff going on that, which I didn't know at the time. Obviously, we all had this awareness of COVID's changed things, but I don't think I was quite ready for that. So I'd spent 6 months trying to recruit, it didn't work out. So then I went for NHS ethics and managed to connect with someone, with Sharon Cohen at STH, and she was brilliant. Like, she managed to help me send out, so I prepared like 400 participant packs, which STH sent out, and I got 13 responses with 12 women who then ended up taking part. So obviously that was huge. And that's where we stand. And then I thought, you know, well, that was so incredibly hard. Obviously, stakeholder recruitment is going to be easy. It's actually, again, proven really difficult. It's been 3 weeks trying to spread the message, send emails, call people. People might seem keen. I know the strike's going on, there's a lot of wider context happening right now, and that make it, I guess, a little bit harder again. So we're hoping we can find some people to talk to, but no, it's been a journey, to say the least. Yeah.
Simon Shibley, I know you had some difficulties because I approved some of your purchase orders for transcription. But a good question for your Viva. If you had your time again, what would you do differently?
Interesting. I would have gone for NHS ethics immediately. I probably wouldn't have waited that long for that, thinking naively that I could have done without. But I think also a lot of it was a really good learning curve. Like, I think if a PhD is a program to prepare you for research, we all come, well, I think we all come into this thinking, yeah, recruitment's hard, but like, don't realize recruitment is hard until you get hit in the face with the fact that recruitment is hard. And I think learning that and taking that forward, I think it's just made me extra conscious of being really critical and thinking about, well, I don't think that recruitment strategy is going to work, or how are we going to do that to make it a little bit more effective going forward, rather than just assuming it's going to work just because you thought it might work. So I think that's something I would definitely take forward. But again, if I could have gone back, I would have applied for NHS ethics like as soon as possible, for sure.
Well, I think if you take this confidence and authority into your Viva, you'll be absolutely fine.
No questions? Great. Guess it's over to Chris. You got the presentation up.
The presentation is there. Can you stop there?
Close this? Yeah. There you go. Awesome.
So we can. Okay, hello everyone. So those of you who don't know me, my name is Kirk, and I'm a lecturer in sport and exercise physiology here at Sheffield Hallam. My main research area is the physiological consequences and effects of training and competing in combat sports, specifically mixed martial arts or MMA. And what I'm going to be talking about today, what I'm going to be presenting today, is a summation of a presentation I gave to the Association of Boxing Commissions last July, August, around that time. And it's around the effects of essentially weight cutting and weight manipulation in combat sports. Now, some of this research is my own, but
most of it is from other research groups. So it's mainly around the overall area of weight cutting in combat sports itself. So weight cutting is the colloquial term given to combat sport athletes rapidly and extremely reducing their body mass just before competition. And this is around the rules of the sport where they're required to be at a specific body mass 24 to 36 hours before the competition starts to show that they're roughly around the same size. Because as we all know, in a physical altercation, the bigger person has an advantage. So the rules are set up to try and minimize that advantage. This started in boxing about 120, 130 years ago, and now every combat sport does it. Now, the cultural belief is that even within a weight division, so whether it's heavyweight, middleweight, lightweight, having a slightly bigger frame or bigger body size than your opponent gives you an advantage. And it's very much a cultural belief within most combat sports. Now, how they go about doing this is severe energy restriction and dehydration. So the days of weight classes representing opponents of roughly similar size, those days ended about 115 years ago, almost as soon as these rules were introduced into boxing. Now it's a regular occurrence that people will try and reduce their body mass to a huge extent in order to qualify their division. Now, I'm just going to hope the internet works for us. I'm just going to very quickly show just a very brief video. It just gives an indication as to the effects of this process. And the video is not a nationwide building society advert. So I'll just mute that whilst the advert goes through. So what we're going to see is a video of a UFC fighter called Elysa Ioannou doing the official weighing procedure that all the fighters are required to do the day before competition. So the day before competition, you have to weigh in public whether a weight is officially taken. Now at this point, Julia collapses off the scale. And we can see she's conscious, but she's obviously confused. Now the medical personnel on staff got her back to her feet and had her sit in a chair. Now at this point, she was still required to weigh in. She wasn't steady on the scale, so the official weight wasn't recorded. So we did ask that she return to the scale. Her official weight was recorded.
135.5. Take away 135.5 for Julia Ioannou.
As you can see, there's clearly something not well with this person at this particular point. She's struggling to stand, she's struggling to remain conscious, and the net result of this occurs was that she was stretching out of the arena. She wasn't able to walk out of the arena under her own control. Sense did prevail and that fight was cancelled. Now, this is not the only time this has happened, just in the UFC alone. Now, for those of you not familiar with the sport, the UFC is the equivalent of the Champions League in football. It's the biggest event, it's the most elite event, and you'd imagine the people involved are the most experienced at these practices. But this has happened multiple times over the last few years, and it seems to become a more common occurrence. So this culture of feast and famine within combat sports athletes is very well known. Most of you will have heard of Ricky Hatton, if not for his combat sports career, for him being pictured in the media of putting on several stone of extra weight in between bouts. This is a current British UFC fighter called Paddy Pimblett. This is a picture of him on the night of his UFC debut, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, pictured in one of his favourite bars in Liverpool. Looking like an elite international professional athlete, looking like your mates on the darts team down the local pub within 2 or 3 weeks. And this is a very common occurrence across combat sports. So How common is it? Well, it's pretty much ubiquitous. Oops. Across all combat sports, but in particular MMA and boxing, every fighter tends to go through this process, and it appears to become more severe as they progress throughout their career. And there are also multiple documented fatalities. One medical case report has a MMA fighter dying during their weight cut from rhabdomyolysis, where essentially the liver is unable to process everything coming through it because the body is too dehydrated. There's also the case of Jessica Lindsay, who was an 18-year-old amateur Muay Thai fighter, dying in her second Muay Thai fight during the weighing process, and Yan Jinping, who died about 6-7 years ago in Singapore, I believe his fight was taking place, and again he died getting ready to weigh in. Now, these documented occurrences are probably far more numerous. There is one website run by Eric Gracken, who's a solicitor based in British Columbia, and he's a combat sports fan. And he runs a website essentially documenting each time someone misses weight or is hospitalized from a bad weight cut. Currently, there's about 450 different instances that he's been able to find and document on his website, and the website only started in 2014. So this is a very serious, ubiquitous problem within combat sports. Now, MMA far exceeds all of the combat sports in terms of the extent and severity of the weight cutting process. In terms of the weight usually cut, it's almost double most of the combat sports in terms of overall body mass. They also cut about 1 kilogram to 2 kilograms more in the final 24 hours before having to weigh in. And they also regain more after competition, and they report cutting a lot more, and they report their maximum weight cut a lot more than most of the sports as well. Now, these numbers on the screen, these are them self-reporting. As we're going to see, the actual numbers are actually much higher from MMA. Now, in terms of what they actually do weigh in, this is a study that we did about 3 years ago now, using data from the California State Athletic Commission. Now, the California Commission, they will also weigh fighters on the day of the competition to track how much they've regained since weighing in. And we found that they actually regained 7 to 15% of their body mass in 24 hours between the weigh-in and them stepping into the cage. And interestingly, we found there was no difference in the weight in the cage or the weight regained between winners or losers. What this means in practice is that fighters at featherweight and below are actually stepping into the cage 2 weight divisions heavier than what they weighed in at. So the notion that fighters taking part in the featherweight division are genuinely featherweights is just nonsense. They're actually welterweights. They're 2 divisions heavier than they actually weighed in at. Every female division also had the same result, where they were stepping into the cage 2 divisions heavier than their official weight. So the amount of weight they're actually cutting is huge. Now, how they actually go about doing this, there's a lot of information up on this page, but this just gives survey results of the methods that fighters use in order to cut weight. And they can be broadly grouped into 2 categories. The first one is highlighted in yellow, where it's energy restriction. They're reducing how much food they take in and it's increasing the amount of energy they use in order to reduce that body mass. The second method is highlighted in blue, which is dehydration. They're using extreme dehydration methods to try and bring as much fluid out of the body as possible, because less fluid in the body, less mass in the body, they weigh less. And one method that contributes to this is a method called water loading, where over the final 2 to 3 days of their weight cutting process, they will drink huge amounts of water in order to trick the body into urinating more and getting rid of more fluid. The research done in this process shows it doesn't actually make that much of a difference to their body mass, but it does make a huge difference to their endocrinological function. In other words, their hormone system is really rapidly affected by this process. So does it actually provide more chance of winning? Well, the literature is very much split. There's a few studies showing that the heavier person in the ring or in the cage does have an advantage, mostly from grappling along with sports. But there's just as many studies showing that there's no difference between winners or losers in terms of body mass in the cage or the amount regained. And this is both from striking sports, grappling sports, and mixed sports. just an indication of how split the evidence is at the minute. These bottom two studies, I'm an author on both of them. So 2 studies I've done have found different results. Now, the reason I think this might be the case, I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation. Now, the effects it actually has on the fighters are quite severe from a physiological perspective. So they do end up with reduced upper body strength and lower body power. Their heart rate response during the sit to stand test is badly reduced. Their cognitive abilities are impaired, and none of these return to baseline within 3 hours of competition. Now, at least 65% of fighters report one wake up going badly, in which they felt they had reduced energy and reduced power, so they can feel just in and of themselves that their abilities are reduced. And they also report concussion symptoms lasting longer after a heavy wake up. In terms of actual sporting performance, boxers have been found to have voluntary force reduced just following a 3% weight loss. We've seen the regular cuts 5 to 10%. And they get tired more quickly following a wake up. And their lactate production is reduced by half. Now that sounds like a good thing. If you have less lactate in competition, you should be able to perform better. What that actually shows is that their energy systems aren't functioning appropriately in order to produce the lactate in the first place. Now, when a group in Australia led by Oliver Barley reduced MMA fighters' body mass by 5%, they had them perform a repeated sled push. So they had to push a sled with 30 kilograms on up and down a 20-meter track as quick as they can. The bottom 2 lines on this chart, on this plot, show the fighters who reduced their body mass. The top 2 lines show the fighters who didn't. So the fighters who don't cut weights are able to move much faster rate on each repeat sprint, and they're able to do it with less exertion. So on this plot that's just come up, the top 2 lines are the fighters who did cut weight, so they're finding it harder to do work at a slower speed than fighters who don't cut weight. And this doesn't reduce after 24 hours. So even 24 hours later, the fighters who reduce their body mass by 5% are finding work harder, and they're able to do less work. Importantly, they only cut 5%. As we've already seen, MMA fighters literally regularly cut 2 to 3 times more. Why do they only use 5% in this study? Well, that's the cut-off limit that an ethics board will say is safe in order to do this to participants. So even though we've got a safe cut-off limit that is shown in the literature, fighters ignore it and go ahead with it. So that's performance. What about health? Well, in a study where they actually got competitive fighters doing a regular weight cutting processes, they took measurements pre and post from the blood. They found increased lactate dehydrogenase and increased alanine aminotransferase. Now, these can be found from muscle damage, which after a fight, that makes sense. They're also significantly increased before the fight as well, which indicates that the livers and kidneys are malfunctioning. They're not doing the job they're supposed to. And in wrestlers, they found that there's a 63% reduction in testosterone following an 8% weight cut amongst wrestlers. And the authors actually think that this could be more severe, but they were so dehydrated, it actually reduced the numbers being found within the blood. Now, the reason why these processes occur, first of all, in terms of dehydration, the blood volume is reduced, which leads to a 25–30% reduction in stroke volume. So straight away, we should all know that if you reduce stroke volume, you're reducing how well the body can function. Heart rate needs to increase, but that leads to a lower cardiac output because heart rate cannot increase to the point that it's making up for the reduction in stroke volume. Now we end up with reduced peripheral blood flow, leading to reduced sweat rate and overheating of the body. Now this is the likely cause of what happened to Elysa Ioannou at this point. And we also have fast reduction of VO2 max and reduced neuromuscular function. So people are stepping into a dangerous combat sport, physiologically impaired from the process they've gone through just to get in there. Now, the amount of energy restriction was reported by Victor Coswig and his team in Brazil. Now, the main outcome reported by this study was that heavier fighters win more often. But if we look at the actual data, this is how much energy the winners and losers of these bouts were consuming in the week before the fight. The winners were consuming a mean of 745 calories per day. The losers were consuming 300. Now again, we should all straight away know just how low those numbers are. And if we look at the macronutrient intake as well, they're barely eating anything. Now in the regain phase, the winners were up to about 5,000 calories per day, and the losers were barely up to 3,000 calories per day. Again, the author said that the winners won because they were heavier. But if we look at the data like this, it's probably because the winners were consuming some energy during this weight cutting and regain process. Them regaining more weight is probably just coincidental to them having energy to use in the first place. Now, this links into relative energy deficiency in sports syndrome, where the body does not have enough energy to perform its basic physiological functions. So if the body does not have sufficient energy to perform its basic physiological functions, and you're asking it to do extra functions, like combat sports training, combat sports sparring, strength and conditioning work, the body is going to switch off its unnecessary systems. So the endocrine system is switched off. Parts of the metabolic systems are switched off. Your muscle and bone regenerative systems become switched off because the body does not prioritize things that are not needed at the point where combat is taking place. So there's a belief that relative energy deficiency in sports syndrome is very high amongst MMA fighters. Now there's one study which demonstrates this in a case study of a professional fighter. This person lost 17 kilograms over the course of 8 weeks, including 7 kilograms in the 36 hours before weighing in. Now this was done at Liverpool John Moores, and they found some striking data from this participant. So in terms of cortisol, if we look at where it says WI, that means at the point of weighing. So the cortisol readings went absolutely through the roof at the point they're about to weigh in. The testosterone readings absolutely went through the floor. Now, this particular reading, 1.4 millimole, 1.8 millimole, Carl Lang and Evans, who was one of the lead authors on this study, he's done quite a lot of digging through the medical literature. He's not been able to find a single instance of someone of an adult male having this low testosterone without them having severe cancer. And this person was 36 hours away from stepping into a cage for a professional international mixed martial arts bout. Looking at their creatinine, again, very, very high. Creatinine can be shown muscle damage, but it also shows liver and kidney malfunction as well. Urea was also spiking at the point at which they were about to get in the cage. And the sodium and osmolality also spiked as well. These numbers have been shown to multiple medical practitioners over the course of the last 5 years since the study has been done. And almost to a man, they've said this person should have been in the hospital bed, not stepping into a cage to have an MMA fight. And these numbers that we see in terms of the amount of weight this fighter lost, they're not out of the ordinary. 17 kilograms over 8 weeks is common practice in MMA. Now, equally as worrying is that competitive MMA and competitive combat sports amongst youths, amongst children, is becoming far more widespread. The International MMA Federation run regular continental, national, and international tournaments for under 16s, under 13s, 14s, 15s. And in Olympic combat sports, it's just as common as well. But there's a lot of evidence to show that kids in these sports are going through the exact same weight cutting processes, using the same practices to the same extent as adults. And it's prescribed almost entirely by coaches and parents. Medical professionals and physicians very rarely are involved in this process. Now, some of the adverse symptoms reported by these children include headaches, dizziness, nausea, increased depression, increased anger, and increased fatigue, which is not surprising when we've looked at the physiological disruption this process causes. Now, this is a relatively qualitative part of the study here, but 2 out of 9 youth females involved in the study reported being amenorrheic for about 1 year prior to the study. In other words, they were not having their menstrual cycle. And 7 to 11% of wrestlers in the study reported having eating disorders at some point during their training. Every person in the study was under the age of 17 at the time. So these processes, these practices are extremely damaging and are setting up children to have very disruptive physiologies at a time where they're they're in the middle of puberty, their physiological processes are probably more important than ever. So in conclusion, weight cutting in combat sports is severe, it's extreme, it's highly reliant on energy restriction and dehydration. It's unlikely that it brings any benefit in competition. Most of the studies show there is even the studies where there are significant differences in body mass between winners and losers, it comes down to about 0.5 kilogram. It comes down to essentially the weight of the gloves that they might put on in competition. So it's highly unlikely it provides any advantage. People are getting into the ring in the cage, still the same size as each other. If they didn't do the weight cutting processes and fought 1 to 2 weight divisions higher, they'd still be facing the same opponents. And it does lead to long-run eating disorders. Now, the effects of these processes can be potentially mediated somewhat by following a weight cutting strategy that does provide energy availability and doesn't rely on extreme dehydration. Now, the group over at Liverpool John Moores and the group in Brazil at Sao Paulo, they've now each done a few case studies showing that following a dietary method that does provide adequate energy availability and provides hydration does lead to significant amounts of body weight loss, but doesn't bring about any of these effects. So essentially, providing enough energy for the body to survive and operate and make sure there's fluid in it, shockingly, makes it work properly. Who would have thought it? But the problem is, this is a cultural problem. Culture change and education is probably going to be our best chance at turning this tanker. And it is a cultural issue. There's very little coach education in combat sports. There is no organisation oversight. Combat sports is very much a Wild West area. So rather than having any kind of rule change, culture change is where we need to go. Thank you for listening. Happy to take questions. Yes,
Because this might be hopelessly naive. I mean, in effect, fighters are gaming the system and being in effect 2 weight categories above when they go into the ring. Why don't they weigh them a lot nearer to the barrel?
Yeah, that's something that does get brought up and recommended quite a lot as well. There's some sports where they do actually have the weigh-in on the day of competition. Now, these sports tend to be events where all the matches are going to be on one day. So, for instance, in Olympic judo, the entire tournament is on one day. The problem with that is that that's how it used to occur in collegiate wrestling in the United States until the mid-90s, when I think 4 wrestlers died in the course of a week. Because they still want to get that advantage. They still think that being a heavier person is going to give them an advantage. So what we tend to see is that on events where they're weighing on the day, fighters are just still going through the same processes and just have less time to recover. Now in grappling sports, they don't tend to cut as much as MMA fighters anyway. About 3 to 4% of their body mass is what they tend to cut, which means they don't need as much recovery time. However, these are grappling sports where they're not having concussive blows placed on them. The potential problem we might see is that fighters will still cut just as much weight, suffer just as many concussions, and have less time to recover. So you're right in that fighters are gaming the system, but they're going to do that regardless of what the rules are, regardless of when the weigh-ins occur. Yeah.
This might also sound very naive, but obviously, like, my bias is thinking like, well, cultural change, let's look at the wider contextual factors and so on, but like partially ignoring that for a second, I'm just curious, like, you mentioned the study that looked at things like testosterone, creatinine, like, cortisol levels. Like, I just wonder what you think, obviously, from your experience and perspective. What if at weigh-in, I mean, we have technology, we have cooking these measures, we can do fingerprint samples. What about things like, well, say people had to be, have blood glucose within a certain level or creatine within a certain level, things like that. Is that not anything that's ever thought about or considered or sounds ridiculous? Like,
the only organisation that does anything along those lines is an organisation based in Singapore called One Championship, and they do a hydration test at the same time as the weigh-in. But the hydration test is a quick and easy one, refractometry, where essentially they measure the mass of the urine at that point, the osmolality of the urine.
Okay.
Very dodgy test. The cut-off point doesn't
Right.
really mean anything. And it's very easy to get around that kind of test as well. The biggest barrier to doing blood tests is who's going to pay for that? Which organisation is going to do blood tests for every single fighter on every single show forever? The UFC is worth billions. They probably could afford to do it. They're not going to want to do it though, because that would mean more fights getting cancelled. That would mean they have to pay for all these things to occur. And then when you go below the level of the UFC, very few combat sport promotions make that much money at all. So it's going to be a case of if you have it in one organisation, what the rest can do. If we do use tests, which tests are validated for that purpose, and what cut-off points are they? Like the authors who had the testosterone study, they said a limitation of our studies, that they were so dehydrated, you can't actually trust these numbers that are coming out. So whilst we might have cut-off points for cortisol, creatinine for a healthy population, we don't necessarily have them for a severely dehydrated population. As well, a lot of these things might be affected by PED use, which I don't really know is very high across those sports as well. So that would be a great option in an ideal world, but this isn't it, unfortunately.
I have some experience with amateur boxing. And there they went through a process whereby the boxer that they had qualified for an Olympic program, I think in the early 2000s, actually missed the plane because he couldn't get his weight down. And that brought in a whole new nutritional approach where they cutting those pounds, and they looked at all of the physiology. And I think as that sport has matured on the amateur side, really not the professional, but there's a lot less onus on cutting of weight. Could it be that looking at MMA, it's just not that state of maturity yet? And as you said, it is the Wild West. And maybe it would take the humiliation of missing out on that, Champions League place, and for people to lose money and prestige, and for the coaches to be hurt by events that's in that process of development.
Yeah, I like the way you used the term immature, because MMA is probably the most immature sport in every sense of the word. Even though I'm loving this on my life, it's a very immature thing. I think the big difference between amateur boxing and MMA is that amateur boxing has governing bodies. They've got Olympic teams. They've got national funding behind it. MMA doesn't have anything close to that structure. And I think we're about 20, 30 years away from anything like that occurring. When you've got a centralized structure, you can build teams of nutritionists and physiologists, people support these fighters. You can bring in a culture change like that. In MMA, there's 100 individual gyms with 100 individual ideas. A lot of coaches want this information, want to find out from people like myself and other research in this area. The other half have no interest in saying, you've never been in the cage, so what do you know? It would be great if there was that centralized structure to help bring that about. We're not there yet. And in terms of people being embarrassed that they've missed out on money, that they've lost out on title fights, they've missed out on places on teams, that happens every single weekend. Every single weekend, fights cancelled it, and there are people who lose place in the championship fights because of it. Nothing's changed yet. If anything's got worse. So,
Yes. Yeah, it must be frustrating.
yeah.
But like you say, it's that cultural thing, isn't it? My friend does MMA and she had a fight recently, but she's someone who naturally sits at like around 60 kilos, and her coach was adamant she should be fighting at 52.
Yeah.
And she had to get through that whole, and now wants her to fight again. So she's like, at 2 days of I can eat normal, and now she's like, well, I have to be back on it now for restrictions. So it's like, it just seems like a lot to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the most concerning, well, apart from the children doing this as well, one of the most concerning thing is that the culture is so strong now that a person who's having their first amateur fight for fun will be cutting the same amount of weight as someone getting ready to fight for UFC world title. There's no separation between what's happening with the full professionals and Sandra doing her first amateur fight for fun because she enjoys it. There's no difference between that. That's deeply concerning.
Is that because the coaches are implementing that ethos? Like, do they normally compete as well, or is that?
It entirely comes from the coaches. The coach and the team is just the culture. If you look at it as if you're a certain height, then you should be in this weight class, rather than looking at what the body structure is
Right.
and whether there's anything to be gained from cutting that much.
Is there almost certain pride elements in it as well? Of like, oh, I managed to do this and this, and that,
Like a badge of honour.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And fighters do regularly talk about, oh, that was a horrible weight cut. Can't believe I did that. Right, let's do it again. Because it is just part of what they do. Yeah.
Normalized.
It is, yeah.
And
Yeah,
part
it's
of
not
their
nice,
mental
but-
preparation as well.
Sorry?
Part of their mental preparation for that.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, who was talking about that? An ex-fighter called Dan Hardy, he was talking about it. He talked about the weight cut as being like a Spartan marching to war. He said that was his march to battle. That was his mental process. And he said he had a couple of fights without doing weight cutting. He said he didn't feel the same going into it because he hadn't had that mental point. So, yeah.
Is that like an association of coaches?
No, there's nothing like that.
Like a way in, there was.
If there was, yeah. And the thing you've got to remember is that MMA as an organised sport is only 22, 23 years old. It's only had rules since 2002. Or agreed rules since 2002. There is the International MMA Federation, which is now recognised by WADA as the international governing body. And there are governing bodies in most countries, but they're very, very loosely organised. Like the English MMA Association, that's existed 4 years now, I think. And they've only just got to a point where they've got a recognised group of board members who are trying to get things up off the ground. But again, there's no legislation that says, it's not like if you want to run a football club, you have to sign up to the FA. There's no legislation that says clubs have to join or coaches have to be qualified. Anyone could walk out of this room, set up an MMA gym tomorrow and call themselves an MMA coach. So we're a long way away from anything like that, unfortunately. Yeah. But there's some people in the sport who are pushing it out there. Like I think the people who are running the English MMA Association, there's people in that group who do have absolutely the right idea that this is front and foremost in their head, rather than trying to be a money-making machine. Yeah.
Are you any increase to publish this?
Sorry, say again.
Will you be able to publish this research?
So two of the studies that we talked about today are, well, every study we talked about is already published now. Two of the studies we talked about are studies I did with Carl Evans and James Morton over at John Moore's, and we're planning about 3, hopefully 4 studies with international amateur fighters through IMAF and through the English MMA Association. So there is work ongoing. It's just really difficult to get on the ground with the fighters at the time to actually collect the data in an appropriate way. And pretty much apart from 1 or 2 papers, every study we've looked at here today occurred in the last 7 or 8 years. Even though it's been occurring for 130 years, there's barely no data on it. We're pretty much just scratching the surface to what's happening here.
We need to recruit people. I know people in Surrey, so it'll be a long journey down for you, but some of them would be probably interested to take part in whatever you're running.
Yeah, put us in touch. I'll make a camping weekend out with the missus.
Yeah.
Do the athletes know of the risk? So the Australian Football League, they just suing the coaches over concussion stuff. And I'm just thinking, is this like a message that the athletes are aware of how much they're long-term damaging their bodies?
They kind of have an inkling,
Yeah.
only because they know how bad they feel whilst they're doing it. And one of the regular things that they tend to talk about approaching Bar Night is they'll laugh and joke about the previous event they did and what they'll look like in the changing room whilst we're getting ready to weigh in, and seeing people's ribs and seeing people's cheekbones and shoulder blades and barely being able to walk. So they've got an inkling that it's bad. And when you show people data like that, they do go, I'm never doing that again. Very few of them actually change what they do though. The fighter who was who they got the testosterone and creatine data from, well, I can tell you that was Paddy Pingler as well. One of the longest I can tell you, he's been on every podcast saying, yeah, these was my data. At the time he was a featherweight, and after they did that study, showed him the data, that's when he moved up to lightweight. because then he saw it, thought, Christ, this is not good. So they have an inkling. Whether it turns into being a lawsuit in 10, 20, 30 years' time, it potentially could do, because the coaches are Yang Ping, the Korean fighter who we said died earlier, who was a Singaporean. He might be Singaporean. His coaches are currently now in court for manslaughter. So there are things moving down that path. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to the speakers. Yeah, the recording. The next seminar was supposed to be on the 15th, however, won't do it because of the strike. And check the diary for the rearrangement. So hopefully we'll have it very soon. Thank you.